When did you expose your professor's dark secret? Professor Mahoney wiped tears off his face and stumbled into class 15 minutes late with dried vomit on his shirt. He smelled like a bar floor. Janet, who sat next to me, whispered that we needed to do something before someone got hurt or failed because of his drinking problem. After class, a group of us met in the library to discuss options. There were 8 students total, and we all had similar stories. Professor Mahoney had been getting progressively worse throughout the semester. He'd shown up drunk to office hours, graded papers inconsistently, and even fell asleep scratching his crotch during a student's thesis presentation last week. Romeo suggested we report him to the department head. We spent an hour drafting a formal complaint letter with specific dates and incidents. Everyone signed it and we delivered it to Dr. Copeland's office that afternoon. We felt relieved thinking the administration would handle it professionally and quickly. 2 weeks passed with no response. Professor Mahoney continued showing up drunk and his behavior was escalating. He'd started yelling at students for minor mistakes and gave a pop quiz that made no sense. When we followed up with Dr. Copeland, she said they were investigating, but Professor Mahoney had tenure and 20 years of prestigious research behind him. That's when Janet had her idea. She suggested we take matters into our own hands by swapping his alcohol for non-alcoholic alternatives. If we couldn't get him fired, maybe we could at least keep him sober during class. It sounded crazy, but we were desperate and worried about our grades and futures. We started small by switching his beer in the faculty lounge refrigerator. Romeo worked as a teaching assistant and had access to the room. He'd swap out Professor Mahoney craft beers for non-alcoholic versions that looked identical. We figured he'd be too drunk to notice the difference, and it might help him get through lectures. The first few days seemed promising. Professor Mahoney was noticeably calmer in class and actually taught coherent lessons. He complained about headaches and seemed irritable, but at least he wasn't slurring through lectures. We started to think our plan was working, and we could survive the rest of the semester. Then Freddie decided to escalate things without telling the rest of us. He'd found out where Professor Mahoney lived and broke into his house while he was at work. Freddie swapped every bottle of liquor for colored water and replaced wine with grape juice. He was proud of himself until Professor Mahoney caught him red-handed coming out of the house with a bag full of empty bottles. The next morning, we all filed into class expecting Professor Mahoney to be absent. Instead, he was standing at the front completely sober and furious. He had a laptop connected to the projector, but instead of lecture slides, he was showing security footage from his home. We watched in horror as the video clearly showed Freddie breaking a window and entering the house. Another camera caught him in the kitchen pouring out bottles and refilling them. Professor Mahoney paused the footage on a clear shot of Freddie's face and let it sit there while the whole class stayed silent. "This is breaking and entering," Professor Mahoney said calmly. "This is theft. This is criminal behavior that could result in jail time and permanent records." Freddie sank lower in his seat, while the rest of us tried not to make eye contact with anyone. We'd gone from trying to help to potentially facing criminal charges. Professor Mahoney clicked to another slide showing all of us in the library planning our intervention. He'd apparently been watching us too. "I know this was a group effort," he continued. "The beer swapping, the planning meetings, all of it. So here's what's going to happen. Everyone involved in this scheme will automatically fail this course unless someone steps up right now and tells me whose idea this was." The room was dead silent. We all knew it had been Janet's idea initially, but no one wanted to throw her under the bus. My heart was pounding as I weighed my options. Failing this course would tank my GPA and potentially ruin my chances at graduate school, but ratting out a friend felt even worse. Suddenly, Janet stood up from her seat. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "It was my idea. All of it. I organized everything and convinced the others to help." Professor Mahoney stared at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted from anger to something else I couldn't quite identify. He walked closer to where Janet was standing, and the whole class held its breath. "Why?" he asked simply. Janet's composure finally cracked, and tears started rolling down her cheeks. She took a shaky breath before responding with words that changed everything. "Because I already lost one parent to alcoholism. I couldn't sit here and watch it happen to you too, Dad." Everyone's faces dropped. They were father and daughter. The whole room went dead quiet for what felt like forever. Nobody moved or even breathed while Professor Mahoney's face went white as paper. He kept staring at Janet like he couldn't believe what just happened. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. Janet was still standing there with tears running down her face and her hands shaking bad. The rest of us just sat frozen in our seats, not knowing where to look or what to do. Professor Mahoney finally cleared his throat, and his voice came out all rough and quiet. "Class dismissed. Check your emails tonight." That was it. He turned away from Janet and started packing up his laptop with shaky hands. We all grabbed our stuff and shuffled toward the door in total silence. Nobody made eye contact with anybody else. Janet pushed past us and basically ran out of the room. I could hear her footsteps echoing down the stairwell as she took the stairs two at a time. The rest of us stood in the hallway for a minute, just looking at each other with our mouths hanging open. Romeo was the first one to speak, and all he said was, "Holy shit," before walking away. My phone started going crazy with messages from our group chat. Everyone was freaking out about failing grades and how this would ruin our futures. Freddie kept typing in all caps about how we were screwed. Someone asked if we should still meet up, but nobody answered. I walked to my car feeling sick to my stomach. Janet had just thrown herself under the bus for all of us, and I didn't know if I should text her or leave her alone. My phone rang, and it was Freddie sounding completely panicked. He was talking fast about how he needed to leave town before the cops showed up at his door. I told him that running would make everything worse, and he needed to stay put. He kept saying he couldn't go to jail and his parents would kill him. I spent 20 minutes trying to calm him down while sitting in the parking lot. That night, I kept checking my email every 5 minutes waiting for whatever Professor Mahoney was going to send. Around 10:30, it finally showed up with the subject line, "Academic Integrity Violation Notice." My stomach dropped as I opened it. The email said everyone involved in the alcohol substitution scheme would receive an automatic F unless we each submitted written confession letters by Monday admitting our role. He listed all 8 of our names and said he had documentation of everything we did. The email ended by saying this was his only offer and there would be no negotiations. I read it 3 times trying to figure out if there was any way out. My whole body felt numb thinking about how this would tank my GPA and destroy my grad school applications. The next morning I woke up to another email, but this one was from Dr. Copeland sent to the whole department. It said the administration was aware of an ongoing investigation into academic conduct matters, and that all grading for Professor Mahoney's classes was temporarily on hold pending review. It wasn't much, but at least it meant he couldn't just fail us immediately. I didn't trust the administration to actually protect us, though, since they'd ignored our complaints for weeks. I spent the rest of the morning Googling university policies and student rights, trying to find something that could help us. That's when I found information about the ombudsperson office that supposedly offered neutral guidance for conflicts between students and faculty. I made an appointment online for the next day, hoping they could tell us our options. The website said they were confidential and independent from the regular administration, which sounded promising. I texted the group about it, but only got a few responses since everyone was still freaking out. The next afternoon, I walked into Madeline Turner's office in the Student Services building. She was this calm, older woman who offered me water and told me to take my time explaining the situation. I told her everything from Professor Mahoney showing up drunk to the beer swapping to Freddie breaking into his house. She took notes without interrupting or making any judgmental faces. When I got to the part about Janet being his daughter, she raised her eyebrows, but stayed professional. After I finished, she leaned back in her chair and explained that we had a complicated situation with violations on multiple sides. She said we definitely broke student conduct codes by tampering with his property, and Freddie committed criminal trespass. But Professor Mahoney also violated university policies by threatening retaliatory grading and using his position to intimidate students. She explained that both sides had legitimate complaints that needed proper investigation through official channels. Turner pulled out a folder and started writing down names and numbers for different offices. She said we needed to contact student conduct immediately to self-report before Professor Mahoney filed his complaint. She also gave me information for campus legal aid, who could advise us on the criminal aspects of Freddie's situation. The most important thing was documenting everything and avoiding any direct contact with Professor Mahoney while the investigation proceeded. She made copies of the emails I'd brought and said she would reach out to the appropriate offices to ensure proper procedures were followed. I left her office with a thick folder of resources and phone numbers, feeling like maybe we had a chance after all. That evening, we all met back in the library to figure out what to do with the information Turner gave us. Romeo pulled out his laptop and started making a spreadsheet while the rest of us divided up tasks. I volunteered to create a timeline of all the times Professor Mahoney showed up drunk or acted weird in class. Everyone started sharing their stories and dates while I typed everything into a document. We had the time he threw a student's paper across the room because the margins were wrong. There was the day he spent 20 minutes talking about his divorce instead of teaching. 3 people saw him drinking from a flask during the midterm exam. The list kept growing, and I realized we had way more evidence than I thought. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet asking if we could talk privately. She said she was sorry for not telling us about her dad and begged us not to make things worse. She wanted to try talking to him again if we just backed off for a while. I showed the text to Romeo, who shook his head and said we couldn't trust Professor Mahoney to change without pressure. The next morning, I met Freddie outside the campus legal aid office in the student center. He looked scared and kept checking over his shoulder like the cops might show up any second. We walked in together and sat down with Sheila Corbett, who had this calm way of talking that made us both relax a little. She explained that breaking and entering was serious, but cooperation could help reduce the charges or get him into a diversion program. She said the fact that nothing was actually stolen and no damage was done, besides the window, helped his case. Freddie kept nodding and taking notes while she talked about different options. Corbett told him he should self-report to student conduct before the police got involved because it would show he was taking responsibility. We left her office and met up with the group to discuss whether reporting himself would make Freddie look guilty or responsible. Half of us thought it was smart to get ahead of it, while the others worried it would just give them more evidence against him. Romeo was searching through university policies on his phone when he suddenly sat up straight and started reading out loud. The anti-retaliation policy said students who report faculty misconduct are protected from grade punishment or other academic consequences. We all looked at each other, realizing this might be the leverage we needed against Professor Mahoney's threats. I forwarded the policy to everyone, and we started feeling less scared about failing the class. Janet texted the group saying she'd met with her dad privately, and he was willing to consider getting help if we stopped pursuing complaints. It sounded like he was just trying to bargain his way out of trouble, and I didn't believe he'd actually follow through. Romeo said alcoholics make promises all the time, but don't keep them without real consequences pushing them. We decided to keep documenting everything while giving Janet a chance to work on her dad. 3 days later, we walked into class, and Professor Mahoney was standing at the front, looking completely sober but angry. He announced he was changing the syllabus to make the final exam worth 70% of our grade. Everyone in the room started whispering because we all knew this was punishment for what happened. Even students who weren't involved in our plan looked worried because nobody was prepared for that much weight on one test. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the new grading scale on the board as evidence. After class, my email showed a message from Aldous Shah at Student Conduct, scheduling individual meetings with everyone in our group. I spent that whole night organizing all my emails and screenshots into folders and printing everything out. I made copies of the timeline I'd created and highlighted the worst incidents to show Shah. My roommate helped me practice what I was going to say, so I wouldn't get nervous and mess up. The meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon, and I barely slept thinking about it. The next day, Dr. Copeland asked our whole group to meet with her in the conference room. She looked tired and frustrated as she explained that tenure protections and union rules made it almost impossible to remove Professor Mahoney quickly. She said investigations could take months and required multiple levels of review before any action could happen. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. She seemed genuinely upset that she couldn't do more to help us right away. I could tell she believed us, but her hands were tied by all the bureaucracy. After the meeting, I went back to the legal aid office to ask Corbett about something I'd been thinking about. I wondered if Professor Mahoney using his home security footage in a university discipline case might raise privacy issues. Corbett's eyes lit up, and she started pulling out law books and making notes about expectations of privacy and admissible evidence. She said this angle might actually help Freddie's case since the footage was used outside its intended purpose. We spent an hour going through different legal precedents, and she seemed excited about the possibilities. The stress was eating me alive, so I made an appointment at campus counseling for the next morning. I walked into the health center and filled out forms about my anxiety levels and sleep problems. The counselor was this older woman with gray hair who listened while I explained everything that had happened with Professor Mahoney and our group. She handed me tissues when I started crying about how we'd tried to help, but made everything worse. She helped me see that wanting to fix someone's drinking problem didn't mean we had to break laws or risk our futures. After the session, I felt lighter and texted Freddie that he needed to meet with Corbett right away about self-reporting. He was scared but agreed to go that afternoon. I met him outside the legal aid office and we walked in together. Corbett had already prepared paperwork for him to sign, acknowledging what he'd done at Professor Mahoney's house. She explained that showing cooperation now would look way better than waiting for the police to come find him. Freddie's hands shook as he signed the forms, but Corbett stayed calm and professional. She called Shah from Student Conduct while we were sitting there and scheduled Freddie's formal hearing for next week. Shah actually sounded impressed on the phone that Freddie was taking responsibility without being forced to. That night, I noticed Janet hadn't responded to any group messages for 2 days. She'd left our group chat without saying anything, and Romeo said she wasn't answering his texts either. I wanted to check on her but figured she needed space to deal with her dad and everything that had come out in class. The next morning, I had to go to Professor Mahoney's class, even though my stomach was in knots. After everyone else left, he walked over to my desk and stood there blocking my way out. He suggested that if I wrote him a private apology letter and admitted I was wrong, maybe this whole mess could disappear. His breath smelled like coffee and something else I couldn't place. I politely said I needed to think about it and pushed past him to get out of the room. My hands were shaking as I walked straight to Turner's office and told her what had just happened. She took notes and said she'd add it to the file about inappropriate conduct. She reminded me to keep documenting everything and avoid being alone with him. 2 days later, we got an email from the department saying they'd assigned a senior faculty member to observe all of Professor Mahoney's classes for the rest of the semester. It wasn't a real solution, but at least someone would be watching him now. The observer was this older professor who sat in the back, taking notes during our next class. Professor Mahoney acted completely professional and taught a decent lesson about research methods. But when Romeo asked a question about citations, Professor Mahoney made this comment about how important trust and loyalty were in academic work. The observer just kept writing notes, but everyone in our group knew that was a threat aimed at Romeo. After class, the senior faculty member pulled me aside in the hallway. She quietly told me to file grade appeals right after finals and hinted that the department would back us up. It was the first sign that other professors knew what was going on and were trying to help without getting directly involved. That evening, our group met at the library without Janet since she still wasn't responding to anyone. We all agreed we wouldn't blame her for anything, even though Professor Mahoney kept pressuring us to say she started everything. We were figuring out that taking responsibility didn't mean throwing your friends under the bus when things got hard. The next day was my individual meeting with Shah at Student Conduct. He explained all the possible punishments we might face, everything from warnings to suspension or even expulsion. But the way he talked made it seem like he saw us as students who'd made bad choices trying to help, not criminals who deserved the worst punishment. He asked lots of questions about why we didn't keep going through proper channels, and I explained how scared we were about our grades. He took notes but didn't seem angry, just disappointed that we hadn't trusted the system to work. That afternoon, campus police called Freddie and scheduled an interview about the breaking and entering. Corbett would be there with him, but hearing the words campus police made everything feel way more serious than before. Freddie texted our group that the interview was set for tomorrow morning, and he was terrified about what might happen. We all sent supportive messages, but nobody really knew what to say. The whole situation had gotten so far beyond what any of us expected when we first tried swapping Professor Mahoney's beer. I couldn't focus on any of my other classes because I kept thinking about criminal records and ruined futures. My roommate kept asking if I was okay, but I couldn't explain the whole mess without sounding like an idiot who'd gotten involved in something illegal. The reality was hitting all of us, that good intentions didn't protect you from serious consequences when you broke actual laws. 3 days later, Freddie got a call from campus police saying Professor Mahoney had filed an insurance claim for the stolen alcohol worth over $2,000. The claim needed a police report, which meant HR got pulled into the whole mess automatically. Freddie's face went white when he told us, because now it wasn't just about student conduct anymore. Romeo checked the faculty schedule that afternoon and noticed Professor Mahoney hadn't shown up for his posted office hours. Word spread fast through the department that HR had called him in for questioning about his drinking and the whole situation with us. Other professors started whispering in the halls and giving us these looks that were half pity and half warning. The next morning, Dr. Copeland sent an email to everyone in our class saying the department would let us retake our midterm with a different professor watching. She didn't say why, but we all knew it was because they finally admitted Professor Mahoney's grading had been messed up by his drinking. It felt like a small win, even though we still had bigger problems to deal with. Janet showed up to class that Thursday, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She sat down next to me and quietly mentioned she was moving out of her dad's house that weekend. Her hands shook while she took notes, and I could tell setting boundaries with her father was killing her inside, even though she knew she had to do it. That same afternoon, we all got emails from HR asking for written statements about specific times Professor Mahoney had been drunk and how it affected our education. I spent 3 hours writing mine, trying to stick to facts without sounding like I wanted revenge. I listed dates when he'd slurred through lectures, times he'd graded the same paper twice with different scores, and the day he threw a student's notebook across the room for no reason. My roommate asked why I was typing so much, and I just said it was for a research project because explaining the truth would take too long. The stress was getting to me so bad that I finally called my parents that night. My mom immediately went into protective mode, telling me to watch out for myself and not let this mess ruin my future. My dad had a different take and said standing up for what's right matters more than playing it safe. Their mixed reactions made me feel even more confused about whether we'd done the right thing. 2 days later, Corbett called a meeting with our group to update us on Freddie's case. She explained the prosecutor was willing to offer a deferred prosecution agreement if Freddie paid back the cost of the alcohol he'd dumped. The group didn't even discuss it before we started pulling out our wallets and phones to send money. Within an hour, we'd collected enough to cover everything because nobody wanted Freddie to have a criminal record over this. The following Monday, Student Conduct finally sent out their decision letters. Most of us got formal warnings that would stay in our files but wouldn't show on transcripts. Freddie got academic probation for a year, which meant he had to keep his grades up and couldn't get in any more trouble. It wasn't perfect, but at least our futures weren't completely destroyed. Romeo texted the group chat that he'd overheard faculty talking about how this whole thing had forced the department to finally deal with Professor Mahoney's drinking. Wednesday's class started with Professor Mahoney standing at the podium, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. He announced he'd be taking a medical leave starting next month, and the department had already found someone to take over our class. The whole room felt different, like a weight had lifted even though nothing was really fixed yet. He didn't make eye contact with anyone while he talked, and left right after making the announcement. The next Monday, a younger professor walked in carrying a stack of syllabi and introduced himself as Guy McKay. He immediately laid out clear grading rules, posted office hours he'd actually keep, and gave us a schedule for the rest of the semester. For the first time since this whole mess started, I actually took notes about the subject instead of documenting another disaster. Guy asked if anyone had questions about the material, and people actually raised their hands instead of sitting there scared. He answered everything clearly without getting angry or making weird comments about loyalty. After class, he stayed to talk with students who needed help catching up from all the chaos. I walked out feeling like maybe I could actually learn something instead of just trying to survive until finals. The whole situation had spun so far out of control from where it started, but at least now we had someone teaching who wasn't drunk half the time. My other professors started treating me normally again, instead of giving me those careful looks like I might cause trouble. Even the department secretary smiled at me when I dropped off a form instead of acting nervous. Things weren't back to normal exactly, but they were heading in a better direction than they'd been in months. 3 days later, I found a thick envelope from the dean's office shoved under my door, and my hands shook opening it, because I thought it was bad news, but instead it was an official memo stating that any retaliatory grading from Professor Mahoney would be reviewed and reversed through a formal appeal process they'd set up specifically for our situation. The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down on my bed and just breathe for a minute before reading the rest, which outlined exactly how to file appeals and get our grades fixed if he tried anything sketchy with our finals or papers. Romeo texted the group chat with a photo of his identical letter, and within minutes, everyone confirmed they'd gotten the same protection, which should have come weeks ago, but at least it was here now. That same afternoon, Freddie started his diversion program at the local addiction recovery center, where he'd be doing 200 hours of community service instead of facing criminal charges. He sent us updates about organizing intake files and sitting in on group sessions, which he said was actually helping him understand what Janet and her dad were dealing with on a deeper level than any of us had really grasped before. I scheduled a meeting with McKay for the next morning to figure out how to salvage my grade after all the chaos. He pulled up my file on his computer and went through every assignment, showing me exactly where I stood and what I needed to do to finish strong without any judgment about the mess we'd created. He mapped out a realistic plan where I could make up 2 missed quizzes and redo a paper that Professor Mahoney had graded while drunk and given me a D on for no clear reason. McKay printed out the whole plan with specific deadlines and grade percentages, so I knew exactly what I was working toward, instead of the confusion we'd been dealing with all semester. That evening, Janet's email popped up in our group inbox, and my stomach twisted thinking she might be mad at us. But instead, she thanked us for trying to help, even though our methods were completely wrong, and asked us to give her dad space while they worked through their issues with professional help. She explained she needed to focus on her own mental health and setting boundaries with her father, which meant stepping back from our friend group for a while, which hurt, but made sense given everything that had happened. I spent the weekend writing my reflection paper for Student Conduct, where I had to analyze my role in the whole disaster and commit to using proper channels in the future. The words came easier than I expected, because I'd actually learned something about the difference between helping and enabling, and how good intentions don't justify bad methods. Shah emailed back that my paper showed genuine understanding and growth, which meant my warning would stay sealed in my file and never show up on external transcripts. Monday morning brought another email from the department saying they were retroactively adjusting all grades from Professor Mahoney's erratic period using a standardized rubric based on our actual work quality, not his drunk scoring. My transcript would survive intact, and I could still apply to graduate programs without having to explain a random semester of terrible grades that weren't my fault. Our group spent Tuesday afternoon drafting a formal apology letter to the class and department for all the disruption we'd caused with our misguided intervention attempts. We were careful not to mention Professor Mahoney directly, since Corbett had warned us about the no-contact order, but we took responsibility for our choices and acknowledged we should have trusted the system even when it seemed slow. Wednesday's department meeting apparently got heated because Dr. Copeland announced new mandatory training for all faculty on recognizing impairment in colleagues and understanding the policies against retaliatory grading. Romeo heard from another TA that several professors had actually thanked Copeland for finally addressing something that had been an open secret for years, but nobody wanted to touch because of tenure protections. I submitted my graduate school applications that Thursday with a note from my advisor explaining the unusual grade situation and delays in our transcripts. She assured me that admissions committees would understand given the circumstances and might even view it as a growth experience since I'd navigated such a complex situation while maintaining my academic focus in other classes. Friday afternoon, Janet sent a brief text to just me saying her dad had entered outpatient treatment and they were starting family therapy together to work through years of issues that went way beyond his drinking. She said there was no magic fix and the road ahead would be long and probably painful, but at least they were finally talking honestly instead of pretending everything was fine while he slowly destroyed himself. The whole thing had spiraled so far from where it started with us just wanting to help a drunk professor get through the semester, but somehow we'd all learned something important about boundaries and proper channels, and when helping becomes hurting. Monday morning, Shaw sent an email with the official student conduct decision attached as a PDF. I opened it on my phone while walking to class and saw the bold text at the top saying, "Warning, internal record only." The document explained that nothing would appear on my external transcript and the record would be sealed after graduation. My hands stopped shaking for the first time in weeks. I forwarded it to my parents who'd been worried sick about my future. The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down on a bench outside the library. Other students from our group started texting that they'd gotten the same decision. We'd actually made it through without destroying our academic careers. McKay had scheduled our final presentations for that Wednesday, and I spent 2 days actually preparing slides instead of worrying about legal problems. When my turn came, I stood at the front of the classroom and delivered my research findings clearly and confidently. McKay nodded along and asked thoughtful questions that showed he'd actually read my paper. After class, 3 different students came up to thank me for standing up to Professor Mahoney. One girl said she'd been too scared to report him herself, but was glad someone finally did something. Their gratitude felt weird since we'd made such a mess of things, but I appreciated knowing we weren't alone in seeing the problem. Thursday was our last class of the semester, and Janet showed up for the first time in weeks. She sat in her usual spot 3 rows ahead of me. When class ended and everyone started packing up, we made eye contact across the room. She gave me a small nod that I returned. We weren't going to be friends again, but there was understanding between us. Neither of us needed to say anything else. Freddie texted our group chat that Friday with a photo of his completed community service certificate. He'd finished all 100 hours at the Addiction Recovery Center, and the prosecutor had officially dismissed his charges. The relief in his messages was obvious, as he thanked everyone for helping with the legal fees. He said working at the center had actually taught him a lot about addiction and recovery. He understood now why our intervention had been so misguided, even if our intentions were good. The following week, Dr. Copeland sent out a department announcement about next semester's course schedule. Professor Mahoney's name appeared on the list, teaching 2 upper-level seminars with a note about ongoing professional development requirements. The department had found a way to keep him employed while making sure he got help. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like the right balance between accountability and support. Romeo ran into Janet at the bookstore, and she told him her dad had completed his 30-day program, and they were doing family therapy together. The sessions were hard and brought up a lot of old pain, but they were finally talking about real issues. She wasn't ready to forgive everything, but she was trying to rebuild their relationship slowly. Finals week came, and our grades posted right on schedule. McKay had graded everything fairly based on our actual work, not the drama surrounding it. I ended up with a B+, which was better than I'd hoped given everything that happened. My GPA stayed intact, and my transcript looked normal again. The other students in our group reported similar grades that reflected their real performance. My graduate school application deadlines were approaching, and I submitted everything with a brief note from my advisor. She explained the unusual circumstances without going into detail and assured the admissions committees that I'd shown maturity in handling a difficult situation. 2 months later, I got my first acceptance letter from my top choice program. 3 more acceptances followed over the next few weeks. My future was back on track. Janet sent me a text in late spring, the first direct contact we'd had in months. She said her dad had been sober for 4 months, and they were slowly working through 20 years of issues. He'd apologized for using his position to threaten us, and acknowledged how his drinking had hurt everyone around him. She was cautiously hopeful, but taking things one day at a time. Their family therapy sessions were helping them learn to communicate without the alcohol buffer. She thanked me for not throwing her under the bus when everything went sideways. Looking back on that whole semester, every single person involved had learned something important. We'd learned that good intentions don't justify bad methods, and that proper channels exist for a reason. Freddie learned about the real impact of addiction through his community service. Janet and her dad learned to face their family problems directly instead of hiding behind denial. Professor Mahoney learned that tenure doesn't protect you from consequences forever. The department learned they needed better systems for handling impaired faculty. And I learned that sometimes the messiest situations teach you the most valuable lessons about boundaries and responsibility, and when to step back instead of trying to fix everything yourself. So yeah, that's it. Nothing too fancy, just how it played out. Thanks for tagging along, and I'll catch you again if you swing back by.